Friends vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. Their lake trip was supposed to be a weekend of laughter and memories, but instead became the beginning of a half-decade mystery that haunted an entire community. What modern technology eventually revealed beneath those calm waters would send shockwaves through everyone who had long given up hope of finding answers. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dawn broke over Lagoa Azul, casting pale golden light across waters shrouded in mist. The fog curled like ghostly fingers above the surface, creating an ethereal landscape that seemed frozen in time. The only sounds were the occasional calls of waterbirds and the soft whirring of João Alves's drone hovering above the lake. Cecilia Rocha stood at the shoreline, her weathered hands clutching a small controller screen. 5 years of grief had etched deep lines around her eyes. But they remained sharp, missing nothing. The retired mother had come here weekly since her son disappeared, but today was different. Today she had help. "I can go lower if you want," João offered, adjusting his position beside her. The young drone hobbyist had approached her last week, eager to test his new equipment and perhaps make a name for himself in their small Brazilian community. He couldn't have anticipated what they would discover. Cecilia nodded silently, her eyes never leaving the screen. As the drone descended through the mist, her breath caught in her throat. There, partially hidden by morning fog, floated a line of abandoned boats, 5 of them, drifting in an almost perfect formation where laughter and music had once echoed during the Festa Junina 5 years ago. "My God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's them!" João zoomed the camera, revealing peeling paint and weathered wood. Are you sure these are the same boats?" he asked, but fell silent when he saw the tears streaming down Cecilia's face. "The blue one," she pointed with a trembling finger. "That was Miguel's. I painted those stripes myself." The image burned into her mind like a photograph, evidence that had eluded police searches, official investigations, and her own desperate attempts to find answers. The authorities had declared it an accident, suggesting the group of friends had been careless, perhaps intoxicated. The case was closed with bodies never recovered, questions unanswered. "Can you record this?" Cecilia asked, newfound strength in her voice. João nodded, already saving the footage. "I can do better than that. I can map the entire area, create a 3D model. We could even—" "Thank you," she interrupted, suddenly looking years younger. "This changes everything." As they stood watching the haunting scene, Cecilia felt something she had tried desperately to suppress for 5 years. Hope. It flickered to life inside her chest, dangerous and powerful. She knew this discovery would consume her completely. The next 12 months of her life would be dedicated to uncovering the truth that these ghostly vessels silently promised. The drone continued its silent patrol above the water, capturing evidence that would soon shatter the fragile peace of their lakeside community and set Cecilia on a collision course with secrets long buried beneath Lagoa Azul's misty surface. 5 years earlier, Lagoa Azul had pulsed with life during the annual Festa Junina celebration. Colorful paper banners crisscrossed above the water, swaying in the gentle evening breeze. The intoxicating aroma of roasted corn and cinnamon-dusted pastries wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of the lake itself. Families gathered along the shore, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns as fireworks exploded overhead, sending cascades of light dancing across the shimmering surface. Cecilia Rocha remembered that night with painful clarity. Her son, Miguel, had been so excited about joining his friends on the water. She could still see his smile as he waved goodbye, promising to be careful, to return by morning. The group had looked so carefree as they pushed their boats away from the dock. laughing and calling to each other over the festive music. None of them, not Miguel nor any of his 5 companions, would ever be seen again. The official search began 36 hours later, after Cecilia's frantic calls to the local police station finally prompted action. She recalled the indifference in the officer's eyes as he suggested the young people had simply gone to a neighboring town to continue their celebration. By the time authorities took the disappearance seriously, precious days had been lost. Tragic accident, the police chief had declared after a mere week of searching. The storm that night was unexpected. Boats capsize. Young people take risks. His dismissive tone had cut through Cecilia like a knife. No bodies recovered. No substantial evidence collected, just a hastily closed case file and sympathetic nods from officials eager to move on. Fernando had tried to comfort her, holding her through nights of sobbing. But even he eventually encouraged her to accept what authorities called the inevitable truth. The community, too, seemed to forget quickly, uncomfortable with the reminder of mortality in their peaceful lakeside town. But Cecilia couldn't silence her intuition. The way the boats had vanished without leaving even a scrap of debris felt wrong. The storm, while sudden, hadn't been severe enough to swallow all traces of 6 people and their vessels. The lack of floating life jackets, the absence of any emergency calls despite the teenagers having phones, none of it made sense. With limited resources and facing bureaucratic walls at every turn, she had eventually retreated into a quiet grief, watching the lake from her window each morning. She collected newspaper clippings, weather reports, and festival photographs, storing them in boxes that Fernando pretended not to see. For 5 long years, she had waited, gathering fragments of a puzzle no one else wanted to solve, until Joan's drone had captured those ghostly images that validated everything she had felt in her heart. Cecilia Rocha knelt beside the cardboard box she'd kept sealed since the police had returned her son's belongings. 5 years of dust coated the lid. With trembling fingers, she peeled back the packing tape, each rip echoing through her silent living room. "I need something, anything," she whispered, carefully lifting out a worn backpack, a water-damaged phone, and finally, a folded paper that caught her eye. It was a festival map from that fateful night, its colors faded and paper warped from lake water. Cecilia spread it flat on her kitchen table, smoothing the creases with her palm. Her breath caught when she noticed pencil markings her son had made, faint lines tracing what appeared to be a narrow channel cutting through the eastern reeds of Lagoa Azul. "This wasn't on the official search grid," she murmured, leaning closer. The marking was accompanied by a small note, Miguel's route, no boats. Her son had circled this area twice, adding what looked like meeting times. The next morning, Cecilia drove to the municipal archives, a neglected building on the outskirts of town. The clerk raised an eyebrow when she requested historical maps of the lake. "Research," she explained simply, unwilling to invite questions or pity. In a back room that smelled of mildew and forgotten paper, Cecilia hunched over yellowed maps spread across a wooden table. Her fingers traced lake contours until she found what she was looking for, an ancient survey map from the 1960s, showing a narrow channel exactly where her son had marked his festival map. "The Fisherman's Passage," read a faded notation. The channel had been deliberately left off newer maps after commercial fishing was restricted in the area. According to handwritten notes in the margins, local families had used this hidden route for generations. Cecilia photographed the map with her phone, her heart racing. This forgotten pathway could explain how 5 boats might have slipped away, undetected that night, away from festival lights, beyond the reach of search parties that had focused on the main basin. Fernando called twice while she was there. She let it go to voicemail, knowing he would urge caution, patience, perhaps even surrender. But the mother couldn't stop now. This hidden channel was the first tangible lead she'd discovered in years of searching. As she drove home, clutching printouts of the old maps, Cecilia felt something she hadn't experienced since the drone footage. Hope, dangerous and fragile, but unmistakable. The official investigation had been careless, missing crucial details that might have changed everything. "I'm going to find you," she promised the photograph of her smiling son on her dashboard, "even if I have to drain the lake myself." João Alves approached Cecilia Rocha with nervous energy. His laptop clutched tightly against his chest. "I have something else to show you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The young drone enthusiast had spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing all his recent footage of Lagoa Azul, driven by a mixture of curiosity and ambition. "It's not just the boats," he explained as they sat at Cecilia's kitchen table. The afternoon light filtered through thin curtains, casting patterns across the screen as João opened several video files. "I've been flying over different sections of the lake at various times of day. Look here." He pointed to a shadowy movement along the dense reeds near where the abandoned boats had been discovered. The footage, captured at dusk 2 days earlier, showed distinct shapes moving with purpose, not animals, but human figures keeping to the shadows. "I enhanced the image quality," João said, clicking through to another clip. "Whoever they are, they're being careful not to be seen. They're watching the lake, maybe watching us too." Cecilia leaned closer, her breath catching. For 5 years she had lived with the hollow ache of her son's disappearance, clutching at fragments of hope that dissolved like mist. Now, concrete evidence of human activity near the mysterious boat sent her heart racing. "Can you tell who they are?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The young man shook his head. "The resolution isn't good enough for facial recognition. But their movements are deliberate. They're not hikers or fishermen. They're observing." Cecilia's mind raced through possibilities. Could these be the same people connected to her son's disappearance? Or perhaps others drawn to the mystery for their own reasons? "There's more," João continued, opening another file. "I programmed the drone to capture time-lapse footage overnight." The screen showed the lake bathed in moonlight, and at 3:27 in the morning, a small boat approached the area, lingered for 17 minutes, then disappeared back into the darkness. "Someone's monitoring the site," Cecilia whispered, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the screen. "They know we've found something." João nodded, a flash of excitement crossing his face. "I can modify the drone with better cameras, maybe even infrared. We could track their movements, find out where they go." For the first time in years, Cecilia felt something beyond grief stir within her, a dangerous, fragile hope. Someone else was out there, connected to the mystery that had swallowed her son and his friends. The shadows weren't just memories anymore, they were tangible, trackable. "Be careful," she warned João, recognizing the eager gleam in his eyes. "If they're watching the lake, they might be watching us too." The evening air hung heavy with moisture as Cecilia Rocha trudged along the muddy shoreline of Lagoa Azul. Her worn boots sank into the soft earth with each determined step. For weeks, she had meticulously combed this area, searching for anything that might connect to her son's disappearance 5 years ago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, something caught her eye, a weathered structure partially submerged in the marsh, almost invisible among the tall reeds. The dilapidated shack leaned precariously, its wooden walls warped from years of exposure to the elements. "Hello!" Cecilia called out, her voice swallowed by the evening stillness. No response came, except for the distant call of waterbirds settling for the night. With cautious steps, she approached the abandoned structure. The door hung askew on rusted hinges. creaking softly in the gentle breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Cecilia pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal scattered debris, empty bottles, waterlogged magazines, evidence of teenage gatherings long past. As she swept the light across the floor, something glinted beneath a pile of rotting leaves. Kneeling down, the retired mother carefully brushed away the debris to uncover a small digital camera. Its once sleek casing was now corroded, the batteries leaking a crusty residue. But when she examined it more closely, Cecilia noticed the memory card slot remained intact. Her heart raced as she carefully extracted the tiny card. Could this contain something important, something connected to that fateful night? The next morning, Cecilia sat across from Lucas Pereira in his modest office at the local newspaper. The investigative journalist's familiar face had aged since they were children, playing by this same lake. But his eyes still held the same intensity, especially now as he inserted the memory card into his computer. "I've known you too long to doubt your instincts," Lucas said, his fingers moving deftly across the keyboard. "If you think this might be connected, I'm with you." The screen flickered to life, displaying a folder of files dated nearly 5 years ago. Lucas clicked through grainy videos of teenagers laughing, dancing around a bonfire, enjoying the festival atmosphere of the lake. "Wait," Cecilia whispered, leaning forward. "Go back." Lucas rewound the footage to a particular segment. The camera operator had been recording friends joking by the water when something caught their attention. The device panned abruptly, shakily focusing on the darkened edge of the lake where indistinct shapes moved with purpose. Not animals, not wind-blown vegetation, but something else entirely. "Those aren't teenagers," Lucas murmured, his professional composure momentarily broken. Someone was watching them from the reeds. Cecilia pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes never leaving the screen. After 5 years of searching, they finally had evidence that her son and his friends hadn't simply vanished. They had been observed, perhaps followed, by figures lurking at the water's edge. The morning after discovering the old camera, Cecilia Rocha was sipping her coffee on her porch when an unfamiliar sedan pulled into her driveway. A woman in a crisp blazer emerged, her posture betraying years of law enforcement training. "Mrs. Rocha, I'm Detective Marta Figuera. I've recently transferred to the district." She extended her hand with professional courtesy. "So now I understand you've been conducting your own investigation into the Lagoa Azul disappearances." Cecilia studied the detective's face, noting the determination in her eyes, but also the wariness. 5 years of being dismissed makes one cautious of sudden police interest, she replied, nevertheless inviting Marta inside. In Cecilia's living room, photographs of her missing son covered one wall, a timeline of evidence that had grown steadily over the years. The detective scanned the display, her skepticism visible but gradually softening as Cecilia methodically presented her findings. The drone footage, the hidden channel, and now the recovered camera. "Most of my colleagues believe this was a tragic accident," Marta admitted, examining the photos with growing interest. "But something about the case file never sat right with me." Cecilia leaned forward. Then why approach me now?" "Because I've seen how cases like this get buried," the detective confessed, her voice dropping. "My supervisor has personally closed 3 similar investigations in neighboring districts. Always the same pattern: young people, water accidents, minimal evidence recovery." Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the windows as Marta revealed more. She had accessed records that suggested deliberate negligence in the original investigation. Search areas inexplicably changed, witness statements altered, evidence catalogued incorrectly. "I can help you navigate the system," Marta offered, But you need to understand the risks. There are people who don't want this case reopened. Cecilia's hands trembled slightly as she poured more coffee. I've lived with threats before. What I can't live with is never knowing. The detective nodded, understanding the weight of a mother's determination. She pulled out her notebook and began outlining what she could provide: access to sealed police reports, proper forensic analysis of the camera, and official requests for underwater searches that had been previously denied. This partnership stays between us for now, Marta cautioned. My position is precarious enough. As they shook hands, Cecilia felt a flicker of hope she hadn't experienced in years. In Detective Figuera, she had found not just access to resources, but something equally valuable, someone within the system who believed her. The rain intensified outside, washing away footprints along the shore of Lagoa Azul. But for the first time, Cecilia felt certain they were finally on the right track. The Brazilian summer heat pressed down on the town like a weight, making the air shimmer above the pavement. Cecilia Rocha wiped sweat from her brow as she returned home from another fruitless day of questioning locals about her son's disappearance. She noticed it immediately, an envelope on the floor just inside her door, as if someone had slipped it under while she was out. Her heart raced as she picked it up. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, bearing the emblem of the local school where her son had studied. Inside was a single sheet with no signature. Just a brief message. They knew too much about what lies beneath the water. The festival was not an accident. Cecilia's hands trembled so violently she had to sit down. After 5 years of dismissals and dead ends, this anonymous note confirmed what her maternal instinct had always whispered. Her son and his friends had stumbled onto something dangerous, something worth silencing them for. She called Fernando immediately, but her husband's response was predictable. It could be a cruel prank," he warned, his voice heavy with concern. "This investigation is consuming you, Cecilia." But she couldn't ignore this lead. The next morning, she drove to the school where generations of local children had been educated. The administrative assistant recognized her immediately, the mother who refused to believe her son was gone. "I need to see the archives," Cecilia explained, her tone leaving no room for refusal. "Specifically anything related to the lake's history." The woman hesitated before leading her to a dusty room filled with filing cabinets. "Take your time," she said softly, closing the door behind her. For 3 hours, Cecilia methodically searched through yellowed papers and forgotten records. Just as fatigue began to set in, she noticed a drawer labeled simply "Community." Inside, beneath stacks of donation records and event programs, lay a weathered, leather-bound book. It was a logbook, its pages stained with water and time. As she carefully turned each brittle page, Cecilia realized she was reading the private records of local fishermen spanning decades. Between notes about catches and weather patterns were cryptic entries. "Patrol tonight, stay clear of the North Channel," and 2 boats approached the restricted area, warned them away. Some entries were written in a crude code, but the meaning was clear enough. The fishermen had been guarding something in Lagoa Azul, something they deemed necessary to protect or hide. Cecilia photographed every page with trembling fingers. Whatever secret lay beneath the muddy legends of the lake had cost her son his life. Now, this logbook might finally lead her to the truth. Lucas Pereira hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of yellowed newspapers and dusty folders. 3 days of calling in favors from old sources had finally paid off. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the faded promotional flyer from the city council archives. "This can't be a coincidence," he whispered, studying the image of colorful boats arranged in a distinctive pattern for the Festa Junina 5 years ago. The formation was unmistakably similar to what Juan's drone had captured just days earlier. The same curved line, the same spacing between vessels, even the way they angled toward the center of Lagoa Azul. Lucas immediately called Cecilia Rocha. "I need to show you something. Can you meet me at the cafe near the municipal building? Bring Marta if possible." An hour later, the three sat huddled around a corner table, voices low despite the cafe's afternoon emptiness. Lucas spread the flyer beside printouts of the drone footage, his journalist's instinct fully awakened. "Look at this," he said, tracing the outline of boats with his finger. "The arrangement is practically identical. Someone deliberately recreated this scene." Cecilia's eyes widened as she compared the images. The resemblance was undeniable, too precise to be accidental. But why? Why recreate a festival display years later in a secluded part of the lake? Marta Figuera leaned forward, her detective's mind already connecting dots. To make it look like they never left that spot. To suggest they'd been there all along. She tapped the table rhythmically, thinking, if someone wanted to create a false narrative about what happened that night, this would be clever misdirection. "A staged scene," Cecilia whispered, the realization hitting her like physical pain. "Someone knew we'd eventually look there." Lucas nodded grimly. "And they wanted us to believe this was where the boats had drifted naturally after the disappearance." Marta pulled out her notebook, jotting down names. "We need to find out who had access to these promotional materials, who knew about this specific arrangement, and who had the authority to orchestrate such an elaborate cover-up," added Cecilia, a new determination hardening her voice. The trio sat in silence for a moment, the weight of discovery settling over them. The coffee grew cold in their cups as they contemplated the implications. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to construct a false narrative, which meant the truth was far more disturbing than a tragic accident. "We're dealing with something deliberate," Lucas finally said. "Someone with resources, influence, and a desperate need to hide what really happened that night." Cecilia stared at the images, her son's face flashing in her mind. "Then we're finally on the right track." Cecilia's persistence was beginning to ruffle feathers. One morning, she noticed unfamiliar boot prints in the soft dirt outside her home, larger than Fernando's, and with a distinctive pattern she'd never seen before. The following night, while sorting through evidence at her kitchen table, the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel made her freeze. By the time she reached the window, only receding tail lights disappeared around the bend. Someone's watching the house," she told Fernando over breakfast, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her husband placed his coffee mug down with deliberate care. "This has gone too far, Cece. You're putting yourself in danger." "I can't stop now," she replied, the familiar argument hanging between them like a wall. The next day, Cecilia spotted Beatriz Mendez in her front garden, pruning roses with methodical precision. The reserved woman had lived 3 houses down for years, yet they'd exchanged little beyond polite nods. What many neighbors didn't know was that Beatriz's daughter had been close friends with the missing group, though she had stayed home with fever the night of the festival. Gathering her courage, Cecilia approached the fence. "Your roses are beautiful," she offered. Beatriz looked up, her eyes darting nervously to the street before responding, "Thank you." They need constant attention. After several minutes of careful conversation, Cecilia mentioned her investigation. The change in Beatriz was immediate, her shoulders tensed, and the pruning shears stilled in her hands. "I should go inside," she murmured. "Please," Cecilia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My son is still out there." Something in those words cracked Beatriz's carefully maintained facade. She glanced around once more before leaning closer. There were boats on the lake that shouldn't have been there, she confided. Late at night, weeks before the festival, men loading things. I told my Isabella to stay away. Did you tell the police? Cecilia asked. Beatrice gave a bitter laugh. The Almeida family owns half the businesses in town. The mayor's brother-in-law runs the port authority. Some questions aren't meant to be asked. But your daughter is alive, Beatrice cut in sharply. And I intend to keep her that way. As Beatrice retreated into her house, Cecilia stood rooted to the spot. Political connections, protected families, the pieces were shifting into a darker pattern. That night, as she documented Beatrice's revelations, headlights swept across her living room wall. Cecilia didn't run to the window this time. Instead, she calmly reached for her phone and called Marta Figuera. The investigation had entered a new phase, one where silence was becoming as dangerous as speaking out. Cecilia's hands trembled as she spread the yellowed weather report across her kitchen table. She'd found it buried in a stack of old newspapers at the Municipal Archives U, a document that should have been part of the official investigation. The meteorological data painted a vastly different picture than what authorities had claimed 5 years ago. This can't be right, she whispered, comparing it to the police report, where officials had documented a mild summer storm with light precipitation. The actual weather station readings showed hurricane-force winds and rainfall that had broken 50-year records. The lake had risen nearly 6 feet that night, creating a maelstrom powerful enough to destroy evidence and transform the landscape. No wonder the search teams had found nothing. Nature itself had been weaponized against them. Cecilia photographed the documents with her smartphone and sent them to Marta Figuera. The detective called back within the hour, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I've been reviewing the police logs from that night," Marta said. "Someone tampered with them. Entries were modified weeks after the incident, but they forgot to alter the digital timestamps." They met at a small cafe far from the police station, where Marta spread her findings on the table between them. The detective looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, betraying sleepless nights spent digging through files. "Look here," she pointed to highlighted sections. "The original log shows 3 patrol cars were dispatched to the lake that night, but the amended version claims all units were dealing with flooding in town." Cecilia felt cold despite the warm afternoon. They knew exactly what they were doing. "There's more," Marta continued, sliding another document forward. The emergency response team was deliberately redirected. Someone called in multiple false alarms across town, stretching resources thin. The realization settled over them like a shroud. The storm hadn't been a tragic coincidence. It had been an opportunity seized by calculating minds. While nature raged, human hands had worked methodically in the darkness. "Fernando always said I was chasing ghosts," Cecilia murmured, thinking of her husband's pleas to let the past rest. "But these aren't ghosts. These are deliberate actions," Marta nodded grimly. "Whoever did this knew the storm was coming. They used the weather as cover, counting on the chaos to wash away their tracks." Cecilia stared at the evidence before her, pieces finally clicking into place. The abandoned boats João had discovered with his drone weren't random debris. They were staged. The storm hadn't claimed her son and his friends. It had merely provided the perfect smokescreen for something far more sinister. "We're not looking at an accident anymore," Marta said, her professional detachment slipping. "This was planned, and whoever orchestrated it had enough influence to manipulate official records afterward." 6 months into her investigation, Cecilia Rocha sat in her dimly lit kitchen, hands trembling as she connected the memory card to Lucas's laptop. The journalist had managed to salvage data from the corroded camera found in the lakeside shack. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. On screen, the grainy footage showed Rafael Santos, one of her son's closest friends, his face tense and eyes darting nervously. I'm recording everything, he whispered, voice barely audible over the distant sounds of Festa Junina celebrations. If anything happens, someone will find this. The camera then panned shakily across the marshy shoreline, capturing what appeared to be human silhouettes moving with deliberate, predatory purpose through the reeds. "Stop there!" Marta Figueira instructed, leaning closer to the screen. The detective's professional demeanor cracked slightly as she pointed to a distinctive shadow. "That's not random movement. Those are people, watching, waiting." Lucas replayed the segment, enhancing the image as best he could. "This changes everything," he murmured, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "This isn't speculation anymore. It's evidence." Cecilia felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread wash over her. For years, officials had dismissed her concerns as a grieving mother's delusions. Now, the truth was emerging from the murky waters of Lagoa Azul, a truth that powerful people had worked to keep submerged. The following week, Cecilia noticed subtle changes in her daily routine. The same blue vehicle appeared in her rearview mirror 3 days in a row. Her mail arrived opened and hastily resealed. One evening, returning from the municipal archives, she distinctly heard footsteps echoing her own along the darkened street. "You need to be careful," Joan warned when she mentioned these occurrences. The young drone operator had grown protective of her. His initial enthusiasm for adventure now tempered with genuine concern. "Whoever these people are, they've kept secrets for 5 years. They won't stop now." Fernando begged his wife to abandon the investigation. "I can't lose you too," he pleaded one night, his eyes reflecting years of shared grief, but Cecilia remained resolute. During a tense meeting at Lucas's apartment, Beatriz Mendez finally voiced what they all suspected. The people in that video aren't random criminals. They're connected to families everyone respects, people with influence. Marta nodded grimly. "My supervisor has been asking specific questions about our investigation. Someone knows we have the footage." As rain lashed against the windows, Cecilia realized their small alliance had crossed an invisible threshold. What had begun as a mother's desperate search had evolved into something far more dangerous, a direct challenge to a system built on buried secrets and calculated silence. "And we need to make copies," she said firmly. "Multiple copies, and we need to be ready for what comes next." The summer sun blazed overhead, withering the morning mist that had once shrouded Lagoa Azul in mystery. Now the lake lay exposed and raw, its muddy banks cracking in the heat, revealing secrets long submerged. Cecilia Rocha wiped sweat from her brow as she trudged along the shoreline, her once sturdy frame noticeably thinner after 6 months of relentless investigation. The air smelled of burnt grass and unease. Local fishermen watched her from a distance, their weathered faces unreadable. She had become a familiar sight, the grieving mother who refused to let go, who disturbed the carefully maintained silence of their community. "You need to rest," Fernando Rocha said that evening, placing a plate of untouched food before his wife. The lines on his face had deepened since she'd begun her crusade. "Look at yourself, Ceci. You're barely eating. You hardly sleep." Cecilia glanced at her reflection in the window. Hollow eyes stared back, haunted by the drone footage that had reignited her quest. "I can't stop now," she whispered, fingers tracing the outline of their son's photo on the table. "We're close to something, Fernando. I can feel it." Her husband sighed, the sound heavy with years of shared grief. "And what about us? What about your health?" He gestured to the pill bottles lined up on the counter, medication for the migraines that had become more frequent, for the anxiety that kept her awake. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice cracking. "But those boats didn't just appear on their own. Someone arranged them. Someone knows what happened to our boy." Fernando knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They felt small and cold despite the summer heat. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "Not just of what you might find, but of losing you to this obsession. The threats, the strange cars parked outside. These people are dangerous." Cecilia looked into the eyes of the man who had stood beside her through 23 years of marriage. She saw his fear, his love, his exhaustion. For a moment, she considered letting go of the investigation, of the hope that gnawed at her heart. But then her phone buzzed with a message from Lucas Pereira. "New information about altered weather reports, another piece of the puzzle. I need to do this," she said, squeezing Fernando's hands, "not just for our son, but for all of them, for the truth." Fernando rose slowly, resignation etched in every movement. "Then I'll be here," he said quietly, "but promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back to me." Cecilia nodded, already reaching for her phone, already slipping away from him and back into the labyrinth of her search. She couldn't turn back, not now, not after coming so far. The tension in the small cafe was palpable as Marta Figuera nervously stirred her coffee, avoiding Cecilia Rocha's piercing gaze. The detective's shoulders slumped under the weight of her confession. "I held back certain reports," Marta finally admitted, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan. "The Internal Affairs Review cornered me. They found discrepancies in my documentation timeline." Cecilia's hands trembled as she processed this betrayal. "How long? How long have you known things you didn't share with us?" 3 weeks, the detective replied, finally meeting Cecilia's eyes. "I found a witness statement that contradicted the official narrative, but my supervisor made it clear my promotion would vanish if I pursued it." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Lucas Pereira, who had been silently observing, placed a steadying hand on Cecilia's shoulder. The journalist understood institutional pressure better than most. "What matters now is where we go from here," he said firmly. "Marta's telling us now. That counts for something." Cecilia nodded slowly, her anger gradually giving way to pragmatism. The truth was, they needed Marta's access and expertise. This painful honesty, though delayed, cleared the air of unspoken suspicions that had been growing between them. "No more secrets," Cecilia insisted, her voice finding its strength again. "Not if we want to find out what happened to my son." Marta nodded, relief washing over her features. "I promise. Everything I know, you know." The following afternoon, Lucas arrived at Cecilia's home clutching a large manila envelope, excitement evident in his hurried movements. Fernando Rocha answered the door. His expression a mixture of resignation and concern for his wife's continuing obsession. "She's in the kitchen," he said simply before retreating to another room. Lucas found Cecilia reviewing drone footage with João Alves. The young man's technical skills had improved remarkably over the months, his initial quest for recognition evolving into genuine investment in the case. "I found something," Lucas announced, carefully extracting a weathered photograph from the envelope. But it was misfiled in the municipal archives, tucked between budget reports from 5 years ago. The image showed 3 municipal workers methodically arranging boats along the shoreline days before the festival. The formation was unmistakably similar to the pattern they'd observed in João's drone footage. "This wasn't coincidence," Cecilia whispered, tracing the outline of the boats with her fingertip. "Someone deliberately recreated this scene after they disappeared." João leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "But why? To make it look like they never left that spot." "Exactly," Lucas confirmed. "Classic misdirection. They wanted searches focused here, while the real evidence was elsewhere." Cecilia's mind raced with implications. The photograph wasn't just evidence. It was proof of premeditation. of a carefully orchestrated cover-up that had begun before her son and his friends had even set foot on the water. The rain tapped against the window of Cecilia Rocha's kitchen as Beatriz Mendez sat across from her, hands trembling around a mug of untouched coffee. After weeks of avoiding Cecilia's calls and ducking into shops whenever they crossed paths in town, Beatriz had finally appeared on her doorstep, eyes rimmed red. "My cousin Ricardo is involved," Beatriz whispered, her voice barely audible above the rainfall. "He worked for the city council during the festival. I've known for years, but I just couldn't say anything." Cecilia's fingers tightened around her own cup, knuckles whitening. The revelation struck like a physical blow. Beatriz's reluctance, her strange behavior, the way she'd hover at the edges of their investigation without fully committing, it all made terrible sense now. "He told me things," Beatriz continued, tears streaming down her face, "about boats being moved, about paperwork being altered. I thought he was just boasting at first, but then your son and the others disappeared, and he stopped talking altogether, started drinking heavily." Cecilia stood up and paced the small kitchen, torn between rage at the years of silence and understanding of the impossible position Beatriz had been in. Family loyalty was a powerful force in their community, bonds forged through generations that weren't easily broken, even in the face of terrible wrongs. "Who else knows?" Lucas Pereira asked gently from his position by the doorway. The journalist had arrived earlier to share his latest findings, only to witness Beatriz's unexpected confession. "Everyone and no one," Beatriz replied, wiping her eyes. "That's how it works here. People see things, hear things, but they look away. My brother-in-law works at the bank that processed the insurance claims. My neighbor's son was on duty at the police station that night. We're all connected." Marta Figuera, who had been silently taking notes, closed her notebook with a sigh. "This is why outside investigators get nowhere in towns like this. It's not just one corrupt official or a single bad actor. It's a web." Cecilia stopped her pacing and gazed out at the lake, visible through the rain-streaked window. The truth was dawning on her with crushing clarity. The enemy wasn't just the people who had directly harmed her son and his friends. It was the collective silence, the shared complicity, the unspoken agreement to protect their own at all costs. "We're fighting more than individuals," she said quietly. "We're fighting a system built on loyalty, secrets, and fear." Beatriz looked up, her face a mask of guilt and relief. "I'm sorry it took me so long, but I'm ready to help now, whatever it costs." The autumn chill crept across Lagoa Azul as golden leaves spiraled onto its surface. After months of relentless pressure, the dam of silence finally broke. Cecilia Rocha sat stone-faced in the county courthouse, as Mayor Paulo Vasconcelos, flanked by 3 ashen-faced officials, admitted to the systematic cover-up that had haunted her for 5 years. Records were altered, evidence was destroyed, the mayor confessed. His voice barely audible over the crowd's angry murmurs. The boats were part of an insurance scheme that had been operating for years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the small Brazilian community. What had begun as Cecilia's lonely crusade had exposed a web of corruption reaching into every corner of local government. The officials had falsified weather reports, tampered with police logs, and pressured investigators to classify the disappearances as accidents, all to protect an elaborate fraud operation worth millions of reais. Marta Figuera stood at the back of the room, her face a mask of professional composure despite the turmoil within. Her supervisor had been implicated, explaining the resistance she'd encountered from day one. The detective caught Cecilia's eye across the room, offering a slight nod of vindication. For Cecilia, the truth brought conflicting emotions. Her hands trembled as she clutched Fernando's arm, Her husband had returned to her side after weeks of separation, moved by her unwavering determination. "They knew," she whispered. "They knew all along what happened to our son." Lucas Pereira scribbled furiously in his notebook, documenting every admission. The journalist had already prepared a series of exposés that would shake the region. The insurance company paid out 8 million for boats that never sank, he explained later at Cecilia's kitchen table. Your son and his friends must have witnessed something that night. Outside Cecilia's window, television crews descended on the normally quiet lakeside community. Neighbors who had once avoided her gaze now approached with tearful apologies. Beatriz Mendez brought homemade pain de queijo, her eyes downcast with shame. "I should have spoken sooner," she admitted. "My cousin told me pieces, but I was afraid." João Alves became something of a local celebrity, his drone footage playing on national news. The young man handled his newfound recognition with surprising maturity, always redirecting praise to Cecilia's persistence. That evening, as twilight settled over the water, Cecilia stood alone at the lake's edge. The vindication she'd fought for tasted bitter. No bureaucratic admission could fill the void left by her son. Yet as she watched the water ripple in the fading light, a weight lifted from her shoulders. The truth, however painful, had finally surfaced from the depths. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more names, more details of the conspiracy. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, Cecilia allowed herself to grieve not for a mystery, but for a crime that had stolen her child. The receding waters of Lagoa Azul revealed more than just mud and debris. As summer heat intensified, the stench of decay rose from the exposed shoreline, a physical manifestation of secrets long buried. Cecilia Rocha stood at the edge, her weathered hands clutching the court order she had fought 12 grueling weeks to obtain. The legal document represented her greatest victory yet, official permission to search the flooded marshes where the drone had captured those haunting images. "It won't be easy," Lucas warned, his journalist's notepad already filled with contacts who might help with the search. Cecilia merely nodded. Nothing about the past 5 years had been easy. The legal battles had drained her modest savings. Each hearing brought new obstacles, missing paperwork, postponed dates, judges suddenly recusing themselves. Marta Figueira had warned her about institutional resistance, but experiencing it firsthand left Cecilia breathless with frustration. "They're hoping you'll give up," Marta explained during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "They don't understand who they're dealing with." Sleep became a luxury Cecilia could rarely afford. When exhaustion finally claimed her, nightmares followed. Visions of her son calling from beneath murky waters, his voice distorted by depth and time. She would wake gasping, reaching across the bed to find Fernando's side empty more often than not. Her husband had moved to the spare room 3 weeks ago. "I support you," he had said, voice cracking, "but I can't watch you destroy yourself." The neighbors' hostility grew with each passing day. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox, some pleading for her to let the past rest, others containing veiled threats. Beatriz Mendez remained her only ally in the neighborhood, bringing food when Cecilia forgot to eat and standing guard during community meetings that increasingly resembled inquisitions. Her doctor noted elevated blood pressure, weight loss, and symptoms of exhaustion. "This investigation is killing you," he warned, prescribing medications she rarely remembered to take. One evening, as Cecilia sorted through photographs for the upcoming search, her hands trembled so violently that the images scattered across the floor. Kneeling to gather them, she found herself face to face with her son's smile, a beach day 3 months before he vanished, his arms slung casually around his friend's shoulders, the lake glittering innocently behind them. Cecilia pressed the photograph to her chest, tears flowing freely. "I won't stop," she whispered to the empty room. "Not until I bring you home." The next morning, despite Fernando's pleas and her doctor's warnings, Cecilia stood at the shore with the court order, waiting for the search team to arrive. The lake had taken her son. Now, finally, it would be forced to give up its secrets. João Alves hunched over his workbench, soldering wires with surprising precision for someone who had never attempted such modifications before. The drone that had started this journey now lay partially disassembled, its sleek body open to accommodate the sensitive microphones he'd salvaged from old recording equipment. "It might not work," he warned Cecilia Rocha as she watched him work, her eyes reflecting both hope and exhaustion. "But if there's anything to hear down there, this should pick it up." The young hobbyist had grown bolder over the months, his initial desire for recognition evolving into genuine commitment to the cause. He'd spent his savings on components and stayed up for 3 nights straight perfecting the design. As twilight settled over Lagoa Azul, the group gathered at the shoreline. The water gleamed like burnished copper in the fading light, deceptively peaceful. Cecilia stood with her arms wrapped around herself, a habit she'd developed during the long investigation. Beside her, Marta Figueira checked her phone nervously, aware that her superiors would question her presence if discovered. "Oh, we're ready," João announced, activating the modified device. The drone rose with a familiar whir, its new appendages giving it an almost insect-like appearance against the darkening sky. Lucas Pereira adjusted the headphones connected to the receiver, his journalist instincts on high alert. "I'm getting something," he whispered as the drone hovered over the submerged dock where the abandoned boats had been found. "Water sounds. But wait." He passed the headphones to Cecilia. Her breath caught as the audio clarified. Distinct metallic clinks echoed through the static, followed by muffled voices. Though the words were indistinguishable, the secretive tone was unmistakable. "There's someone down there," she gasped, her hands trembling as she clutched the headphones. Beatriz Mendes, who had finally overcome her reservations to join them, listened next, her face drained of color. "Would I recognize that voice?" she whispered, confirming what they had long suspected, a direct connection between the submerged area and the insurance scheme that had claimed so many lives. The recording continued for 7 minutes before João guided the drone back, its battery nearly depleted. As the group huddled around a small tablet reviewing the audio, their expressions shifted from shock to grim determination. "This is it," Marta said, her professional demeanor momentarily cracking. "This is what we needed, proof of ongoing activity, not just past crimes." Cecilia nodded, a strange calm settling over her. After endless dead ends and sleepless nights, after the strain on her marriage and her health, they finally had irrefutable evidence. "Tomorrow," she said simply, looking at each face in their circle. "We go to the authorities tomorrow." The lake breeze carried the scent of impending rain as they silently agreed. The time for investigation was over. The time for justice had come. The operation began before sunrise, the lake shrouded in mist as police boats sliced through the still water. Cecilia Rocha stood on the shore, her thin frame wrapped in a weathered jacket against the morning chill. After 12 months of relentless pursuit, justice was finally within reach. We're ready to begin," Marta Figueira announced, her police badge catching the first rays of dawn. The detective had risked her career for this moment, convincing her superiors to mount a full recovery operation after public pressure became impossible to ignore. João Alves hovered nearby with his drone, now equipped with professional-grade cameras borrowed from Lucas Pereira. The journalist himself stood documenting everything, his press credentials ensuring the operation couldn't be buried like the evidence had been. "There," Cecilia pointed, as the first boat emerged from the depths, water cascading from its rotted hull. Workers in diving gear guided the vessel toward shore, using thick cables and a mechanical winch. The crowd that had gathered, locals, reporters, officials, fell silent as the ghost boat made its journey to land. Beatriz Mendez appeared at Cecilia's side, her eyes fixed on the recovery. "I should have spoken sooner," she whispered, but Cecilia merely squeezed her hand in response. There would be time for regrets later. As the morning progressed, 6 boats were recovered, each telling its own story of deception. Marta directed her team to photograph and catalogue everything. In the 3rd vessel, officers discovered a hidden compartment beneath floorboards containing waterlogged documents and a plastic bag of personal effects, a watch, a wallet, keys. Cecilia recognized the watch immediately. Her son had worn it every day since his 16th birthday. She reached for it instinctively, but Lucas gently intercepted her hand. "Evidence first," he reminded her softly, "then closure." The 4th boat yielded the most damning proof: altered registration numbers and insurance documents sealed in waterproof containers. João's drone captured everything from above, creating an undeniable record that couldn't be manipulated or erased. By midday, the operation had drawn attention from federal authorities. Black government vehicles arrived, their occupants in suits despite the heat, taking control of the evidence with practiced efficiency. Through it all, Cecilia remained steady, her face a mask of determined calm. Only when the last boat was secured did she allow herself a moment of vulnerability, turning away from the cameras to wipe tears from her weathered cheeks. "We did it," Marta said, joining her away from the crowd. "You did it." For the first time in 5 years, Cecilia felt the crushing weight of uncertainty begin to lift. The pain would never fully disappear, her son was still gone. But the truth had finally surfaced from the murky depths, where grief had consumed her. A fierce pride now took root, nourished by the knowledge that her persistence had brought light to darkness. The forensic team worked methodically through each recovered boat, their gloved hands revealing secrets long hidden beneath waterlogged seats and rotted floorboards. Cecilia Rocha watched from behind the police tape, her breath fogging in the early morning chill. 5 years of searching had led to this moment. "We've found something," called out one of the investigators, holding up a waterproof pouch containing a notebook. The pages, though damaged, contained handwritten notes documenting suspicious boat registrations and insurance claims, all in the handwriting of Cecilia's son. Marta Figuera approached with the evidence bag. "Your boy was smart," she said, her voice gentle but firm. They were tracking the scheme for months. These boats were being registered, insured at inflated values, then reported stolen or sunken. The truth unfolded with brutal clarity. The group of friends hadn't vanished by accident or fled on a whim. They had stumbled upon a sophisticated insurance fraud operation involving several prominent community members, including 2 council officials and a senior police officer, Marta's former supervisor. "They were silenced," Lucas Pereira whispered, standing at Cecilia's side, his journalist notebook forgotten in his hand. They threatened to expose everything." The investigation revealed that the festival night had provided perfect cover. The storm, the celebration noise, the darkness, all used to mask the confrontation that ended with 5 young lives extinguished and their bodies hidden in the lake's murky depths. João Alves, whose drone had started it all, stood silently filming the recovery operation. His technology had accomplished what years of official searches could not. The young man's face showed both pride and horror at what his hobby had uncovered. By afternoon, divers recovered personal effects from a submerged cave. Watches, wallets, phones preserved in waterproof containers. Among them was Cecilia's son's silver bracelet, the one she had given him for his 20th birthday. She clutched it to her chest, tears streaming down her weathered face. Beatriz Mendez approached hesitantly. "I should have spoken sooner," she admitted, shame evident in her downcast eyes. "My cousin told me pieces, but I was too afraid." "You spoke when it mattered," Cecilia replied, surprising herself with the forgiveness in her voice. Fernando Rocha arrived as the sun began its descent, wrapping a blanket around his wife's shoulders. Their relationship, strained by years of her obsession, found new footing in this terrible vindication. Cecilia stood on the shore, watching as those who had once dismissed her as a grieving mother, lost in denial, now approached with solemn nods of respect. She was exhausted, her body aching from the long battle, but her spirit remained unbroken. "They thought they buried the truth with our children," she said to no one in particular, her gaze fixed on the boats that had finally yielded their secrets. But some things refused to stay submerged. The sunset painted Lagoa Azul in shades of amber and gold as a small crowd gathered at the shoreline. Cecilia Rocha stood with her allies, watching as recovery crews hauled the final ghost boat from the murky depths. Its faded blue paint peeled away in strips, revealing the truth that had been submerged for 5 long years. "It's really over," Marta Figueira whispered, her detective's badge catching the fading light. She placed a gentle hand on Cecilia's shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed impossible when they first met. Lucas Pereira adjusted his camera, capturing the moment for his upcoming exposé. "This will change everything," the journalist said, his voice thick with emotion. "No one will be able to ignore what happened here." Nearby, Beatriz Mendes stood slightly apart, her face a complex map of relief and grief. The woman had finally freed herself from the burden of silence, even as it meant confronting her family's involvement in the conspiracy. "Thank you," Cecilia said simply, looking at each of them in turn. Her voice no longer carried the desperate edge that had defined her for years. "For believing me when no one else would." The recovery team called out as they discovered something in the boat's hidden compartment, a waterlogged backpack that might hold more evidence. Cecilia didn't rush forward as she once would have. She knew the process now, trusted it even. Fernando approached cautiously from the parking area, keeping his distance as he had throughout the investigation. His eyes met his wife's across the crowd, and for the first time in months, there was understanding rather than fear in his gaze. João Alves packed away his drone, the device that had started everything. The young man had gained the recognition he craved, but also something more valuable: purpose. "I never imagined it would lead to this," he said, gesturing toward the boats lined up like silent witnesses. As darkness settled over the water, fishermen lit small fires along the shore, reclaiming their territory from years of superstition and avoidance. The flames reflected on the lake's surface, stars dancing on water that no longer held secrets. Cecilia sipped her bitter coffee from a thermos, noting how steady her hands had become. The trembling that had accompanied her for years had finally subsided, replaced by a calm certainty. "What will you do now?" Lucas asked, closing his notebook. The retired mother looked out over Lagoa Azul, no longer seeing it as a watery grave, but as a place cleansed by truth. "Live," she answered simply. "Remember them properly. Make sure this never happens to another family." The lake lapped gently at the shore, its rhythm peaceful rather than menacing. Cecilia knew the pain would never fully leave her, but it had transformed into something she could carry without breaking. In the end, a mother's resolve had proven stronger than corruption, stronger than time itself.